So it's 4 after. Why don't we get started? If that works for everyone. So thank you very, very much for coming. We appreciate it. I'm excited about tonight's talk. Aaron is a personal favorite of mine. He is also known as Awesome Aaron, and he's a kick-ass CISO and an amazing human being. So Aaron, I'm going to turn it over to you so that you can introduce yourself and tell everyone about yourself and about what it's like to be a CISO.
All right, no pressure. Thank you so much for having me. Great to virtually meet everyone. And so yeah, for the next 45 minutes to an hour, we'll talk a little bit about what it means to be a CISO, kind of how I got here, and a little bit about just what my background was, which I don't think was very traditional for the cybersecurity world. And I'd like this to be interactive. If you have questions, don't hesitate, unmute, ask a question. I'd love to get some back and forth. Anything you need to know, just ask. So just a little bit about myself. I am a proud Slytherin and a reformed red teamer. The first jobs that I really worked in cybersecurity was on the red team, both doing assessments as well as doing ethical hacking, penetration testing, lock picking, some of which involved jumping over turnstiles and having to outrun guards. So cardio was not in the job description, but was absolutely useful.
So Aaron, what is a Slytherin?
It is the absolute best house in Harry Potter. I highly recommend. There's some great movies. If you haven't seen, I definitely recommend watching.
And what's a red teamer?
So the red teamers are the groups that will perform the offensive security. So typically you want to be, as a company, you want to know where your holes are, where your vulnerabilities are before the attacker exploits it. So when I was working in a consulting firm, we were hired to essentially simulate the bad guys, break into places, whether it was physically or virtually, and see if we can obtain laptops, obtain sensitive data, obtain trade secrets, or even siphon money. And the way I got here was an interesting route. I had a BS in business information systems and classical languages and literatures. Not a normal path. I was abysmal at math in college, and I didn't even know that security was a possible job. So I started off as a consultant, and I was put in the information security practice where we were performing basic assessments, where companies would hire us just to go through compliance checklists, figure out, are they compliant to this regulation or that? And after a while, I started getting a little bored and started learning, well, we're asking if they do vulnerability management. What's a vulnerability? Let me look that up. We're talking about web application security and cross-site scripting and SQL injection and all these terms I never heard. And I just started doing a little bit of research. And then I found out we had a hacking group at the company. I went to the manager and said, I have absolutely no idea how to do most of this, but hypothetically, based on what I've read, this is how I would do it. This is what I'd like to learn. And they took a shot, let me shadow the team, and I joined for a few years. So networking is probably the biggest takeaway you should have for both how to get to a CISO and how to stay an employed CISO. Is you always have to keep networking, meeting new people, building your contacts, and just attending events and growing your knowledge. This industry changes quite a bit. And we've talked about the word CISO a lot, and sure you've heard that, but what actually is a Chief Information Security Officer? Or am I even pronouncing it right? Maybe it's CISO, CISO, CISO. You'll hear all sorts of different ways. But at the end of the day, the Chief Information Security Officer, the way I've looked at it, and a lot of the firms I've been at, you're responsible for quite a bit. You're responsible for security operations, risk and threat intelligence, fraud prevention, security architecture, identity management, investigations, but then you're also responsible for the program management. How is the program as a whole doing? Governance and risk management. Because at the end of the day, if you can't manage risk, you can't manage security. So understanding how that plays in is really important. And especially now, the CISO role is much more expansive. A lot of regulators across the world are now asking companies to make sure that they have an executive in charge who is familiar with cybersecurity, but can also speak to the board of directors, that could speak to a regulator, that understands how security fits into the business of the company. So you need a foundation now in both technical and non-technical roles.
How do you learn all that?
Giving up a little bit of your life sometimes, but a lot of it is, some of it you learn on the job, some of it you learn networking. I would go to events, and if I run into a CISO or someone who's even working in a field or an industry that I'm not familiar with, I have a good friend who works in malware reverse engineering. I had never had to do that before in my life, but I just asked a ton of questions because it sounded really cool. And when you start going down those rabbit holes, you learn what resonates with you, what's interesting to know. If I have to reverse malware, I can't do it. But as a result of research, I at least know the right fundamental questions to ask. So a lot of it is just reading newspapers, reading articles, building a little lab sometimes to play around and see how things work.
Do you have to be hands-on, or can you be more on the risk side?
I would say you need a bit of a mix. You can come up from either side, but there are going to be times where you're going to be asked to go into a tool and do something, or to run an investigation. That doesn't mean you have to be hands on the keyboard performing the forensic analysis, but it means you have to have that background to understand the questions to ask during an incident.
That makes sense.
And I think if you do come from a risk side, or if you have that risk mindset, you actually do have a bit of a leg up, because it's really important to understand that security is a function of risk. And I'll talk about that throughout the presentation here. Is you have to understand where security is important to the business, what areas need to be more secure than others. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And that actually brings us to the topic of what types of CISOs are there. There's no catch-all, there's no one type of CISO. And this is not an exhaustive list. You can even embody multiple types, but a lot of times hiring managers and organizations have a tendency to prefer one type or the other based on the industry, based on their regulatory landscape, based on what their shareholders are looking for. One of the most common kinds of CISOs that I've seen is the technical CISO. And in many cases, you might not have the official designation of CISO. Some companies, a lot of times in banking, will go with a VP of security, or an executive vice president of security, or head of security. But a lot of times the purely technical CISOs, they're not really in the heavily regulated environments, and they're typically reporting to the chief information officer or chief technology officer. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's important to know how your business is going to view you as a CISO. And that's something, when I was interviewing, I was looking at the different types of roles and trying to figure out, how do I want to be viewed as a security officer? The skills that I bring to the table, coming from a pen testing background, and then moving over to the blue side, which is the defensive side. Do I want to stay on the very technical side? Do I want to move on? This was really important to understand when interviewing. And in a lot of cases where technical CISOs are successful is when the business itself is focused on the technology as an enabler. And security is part of that technology. A lot of tech startups, a lot of fintech companies, a lot of retail companies that have been pivoting to the technology as an enabler, security has to be baked in, because without a secure platform, your consumers will jump to something that's more secure more often than not. So you have to understand, while it's a technical CISO, it's not purely a technical role, but it is one where you do have to understand the business and figure out how security is embedded at the beginning in the process for that business.
Mm-hmm.
The other type of CISO is a risk or compliance CISO. And I think, Stacey, to your point, asking about the risk background or the hands-on background, you can have either and become a CISO. You can have both and become a CISO. The risk and compliance CISO is very heavily in regulated environments. Think of multinational banks that have 40 plus regulators they need to work with. You need a chief security officer that can balance what do they need to do in their program to improve security and meet the regulator demands. Because if a regulator thinks you're not secure enough, you're not going to be able to do business in that area.
Right.
And then the last type of CISO I want to talk about is kind of the strategic CISO, often brought in to oversee program changes and transformations at a company and kind of pivot how security is thought of at the company. The technical CISO will often focus on the CIO, CTO's realm. How do I build security into a development pipeline? How do I help deploy secure code? The compliance CISO might focus a bit more on how do I generate metrics appropriately? How do I reduce vulnerabilities in my environment? The strategic CISO has to look several years ahead, and rather than thinking of tactical items like that, think about what are our core businesses and how do we secure those at every step of the way, both from a process perspective, where you might not touch anything technical, you're going to build a process to make sure that if someone sends you a fake payment, you have a process in place that no one can fall for anything. Or if someone will fall for it, it gets caught before payment is released. This will typically be seen in more mature organizations that have an established security program, where they have vulnerability management, they have a security operations center and an incident response team, and they're looking to mature and move to the next level.
I presume that you have to have been one of those other kinds of CISOs before you get up to the strategic CISO.
That tip, from what I have seen, that is typically how it has worked. There have always been outliers, but it typically helps to have that background so that when you go to the strategic side, when you're presenting to boards, when they're loaning you out as an advisor to companies they've acquired or invested in, they want you to have that experience under your belt already.
Sure.
And touching very briefly on the reporting lines, I'm sure every one of you may be in an organization that has very different structure, different industries, and where security fits in, there's no right answer. It really depends on how the business works and what makes sense for it. But overwhelmingly, it does appear that a lot of CISOs still report to the chief information officer. You see some to the CTOs or the engineering side. But what I found very interesting was that the fourth most common is to the chief executive officer. And I've actually been seeing that as a trend going up in the last few years, where people realize how valuable security is now, where if you have the wrong type of incident, you might not have a business to come back to, where you have regulators that are requiring expertise. So more and more, this is seen as something that the head of the company, the CEO, needs to be involved in. But when you're not reporting to that CEO, what I found you really, really need to work on is understanding who are you reporting to and what are their objectives. Because security at times will have a conflict of interest, let's say with the engineering, where if you have a DevOps process, you want to be able to release and iterate. If we're playing buzzword bingo, if you're an agile shop and you want to release very quickly, you might have a lot more bugs and security might want to slow down a little bit. So understanding what the objectives are and fitting into that is very important. Any questions on that so far? Any comments?
So I have always found it interesting in the various companies, because at RBC, like what you're describing here, we report into the CIO. And like what you were saying in terms of, is a CISO called a CISO? We also have a chief information security officer.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we have someone who's above the CISO who plays that role. And then we have the CISO, who's in our case is very strategic. And then we have all the different departments that report into him. So I think that that's a very typical, especially for a bank, kind of model for everyone to have.
And what I've seen a lot of times based on business units, especially for multinational companies, you might have a CISO for the Americas, a CISO for APAC. You might then have a CISO that is for specific types of business units that bring in a significant chunk of revenue. Because as a CISO, you have to be aligned to that business and make sure that, I used to work at a major financial company that had different lines of business.
Yeah.
You couldn't apply security across the board for a lot of those businesses because certain priorities had to take place. Some areas really cared more about availability, making sure that no one can take down the network, and others didn't care as much about that, but they cared about the confidentiality of the data. So you might have multiple CISOs or business information security officers
Yep.
where they focus on securing that entity. And that's a really good starting point. If you're thinking in your career, you want to become a chief security officer, the route of going through the business information security officer is a really, really good idea because it exposes you to the business. You have a laser focus on making sure you secure that specific business line. And that gives you that great experience of both the security angle as well as the business expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. And becoming a BISO is a whole lot less painful than becoming a CISO, because typically for the CISOs, first of all, there's usually a limited number per company, whereas BISOs, you typically have one per business line, which makes the job opportunities far greater. And you still have a tremendous amount of responsibility for that business line and choosing the technologies and being engaged in the risk. And so it's a great stepping stone.
Absolutely. And I saw Jess asked a question about the types of CISOs described. Is it a guideline based on an individual strength or what the company needs? This is more of what the company needs. For example, I have expertise on the risk and compliance side as well as the technical side. But for the firm I'm with now, the technical side was more important. And what they were looking for was someone to transform the security stack from a technical perspective and move it up to industry best practices and be a little more hands-on. So a lot of times you'll see companies determining, even if they don't know what they're asking for based on the job descriptions, you can typically guess what type of CISO they're looking for. And you can look at your skill set and see, you know what, I can do that, or I can do a little bit of that. Let me brush up on a few skills, or this is an area that I want to grow in because I'm seeing more and more companies asking for the same item.
How much do the certifications that you hold play into this? And how did you choose the certifications that you've done?
All right. So I have a somewhat controversial opinion is I don't think certifications are super helpful unless you're starting at entry level to come into security. And where certifications are somewhat helpful is it shows dedication that you're learning, that you're passionate, you have that self-learning, that drive to learn more and execute on it. There's very few certifications I've seen that have very practical hands-on elements. There's one called the OSCP, the Offensive Security Certified Security Professional, and that one involves essentially a penetration test over 24 hours. That's one of the few really technical ones I'm aware of. Like I have a CISSP, and I think I was actually telling Stacy earlier, I have a CISSP because I wanted to get out of work that day and asked if I took the test, can I take the rest of the day off? I'm seeing less and less companies actually asking for certifications, but it doesn't hurt if you're dealing with a large company and you have to get through the HR barrier just to talk to the hiring manager.
Totally agree on that.
Yeah,
because
HR cares
very
more.
often they won't even look at your resume, right? Unless you have that certification. So just to get the door open.
Yeah, any large company, if there's an HR screener first, a lot of times they look for a CISSP as a way to just weed out candidates because they get so many. Typically, I found the actual hiring managers in security don't care as much about the certification. They really look at how passionate you are about it. Are you capable of learning? Every person I've talked to has pretty much said they don't care as much about the technical skills. They care about the critical thinking skills, the culture fit. Are they willing to learn and are they capable of learning what their thought process is?
So how do you teach that to someone though, Aaron? I mean, if people on this call want to go out and get critical thinking skills, what does that look like?
Oh, throwing the hard questions. So I think when you look at it from a security perspective, a lot of critical thinking interview questions I've seen are around how you respond in an incident. They don't really care, is it a Windows system? Is it a Mac? Is it Linux? Do you know which command to type to obtain forensics? They want to understand your thought process. So some ways to learn about that is read up about how incidents have happened. There's some good write-ups of major breaches that have been out there. Not going to name names on this call, but you can definitely find a few, and I'm happy to share some resources. But learning about how those breaches occurred, and then you could see, well, this happened because they didn't sign their code properly and someone got in that way. You then want to reverse it and think, how could I have stopped it? So when you're in those interviews and you can walk through your thought process, I've had interviews where I said, I put Python on my resume at the time. I didn't really know Python. I wrote a couple scripts. and they asked me a question. And they're like, how would you go about doing X, Y, and Z? And my first response was I would go to stackoverflow.com, find someone else who did it, and copy paste. And that they said that was one of the best answers they got. They want to see how you're going to solve a problem creatively versus knowing exactly which command to type.
Very helpful.
So
And what do you do for fun? Because it sounds like what you do for fun is read these magazines.
I mean, it's fun for me. I have some hobbies, even though some people here probably will disagree. I like to cook. I used to like to play tennis, except I still can't beat my dad, and it is disheartening. But a lot of what I try to do is I do like a lot of technology, so I'll tinker a little bit. I'll try to build something in the cloud. I'll build a computer. Yes, I live and breathe tech.
What do you find the differences between your private investment firm and S&P, where I noticed you worked prior to this?
I think some of the big differences is scale and scope. S&P had a lot of regulators because it's major multinational financial. At the investment firm, it's a smaller shop with less. So you're actually able to be a little more nimble. If we think, hey, this solution would work and we should procure this, we should engineer it, and we want to deploy it. At a large company, you can have multiple layers of red tape. It could take you a year or more to execute on a project. Whereas at some of the smaller places, you're able to see really concrete, tangible results quickly. We were able to go from zero threat intelligence processes and DLP and data loss prevention processes, and we got those systems up and running in a few months.
Wow.
So just being able to move quickly it's been great.
So we've noticed that the average time you're a CISO is typically 2 years, although that's certainly not true at RBC, and I'm not sure what your experience is. Why do you think that is that CISOs move around so much?
I think there's three main reasons why you see CISOs moving. And sometimes it's because they had their first CISO title, they wanted to move on to the next phase where either the compensation was more or the challenge was more, or the company may not have been the right fit where they didn't really know what they wanted in a CISO. Other times, unfortunately, it's because a company gets breached, and rather than looking at a CISO as a resource to navigate the incident and manage that incident, they look at the CISO as the scapegoat.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the other reason that people leave is it's compensation, honestly. It's a very competitive market, and compensation doesn't just mean your straight financials. It could be the benefits. Due to COVID, a lot of companies figured out you can work remotely. I know a CISO that actually took a little bit of a pay cut to go somewhere where they can work full-time remote. And you have a lot of power in the market because there's not enough CISOs for the companies that need them.
Interesting. How long have you been at your current location?
Almost 2 years. I know, hitting that point. Hope no breaches.
There you go.
Yeah. And I actually think it's worth touching on that, though.
Yeah,
that
please.
breach comment is the biggest way to sell yourself in an interview season. I spoke to a lot of hiring managers on this one, is if you can show that you've survived a breach. I've actually spoken, before I got this job, I had spoken to several recruiters who had all said their clients were only looking for a CISO that has experienced a breach before. That's kind of the experience benchmark a lot of times they're looking at. And it doesn't have to be that as a CISO, you were part of the breach, but were you in an incident? Did you contribute to it? Have you survived it? Because that's what most people worry about. If you're going to be in the news, if there's going to be a breach, a lot of times the CISO is the one that has to talk to the media. The CISO is the one that has to talk to the regulators or the shareholders. They want to make sure that you're capable of navigating that incident.
Interesting. So media relations, regulatory experience, senior management communication.
Mm-hmm.
All of that goes into, again, you go back to that strategic CISO who would need to be doing all of that. Not the technical CISO.
Exactly. And the communication is one of the most important. because at the end of the day, and we'll definitely touch on this in a bit, but at the end of the day, your job is marketing and branding. Perception is
Great
always
segue.
stronger than reality. So you have to make sure people understand what is security doing. You are an evangelist. You have to make sure they know what you're doing, that you're present, that they understand how you impact them. I do, for example, sessions with our traders, our portfolio managers, our analysts. They're very aware of what security is doing. And that's really what your job is making sure people know security's there, that it's present, that you're doing something, that you're impacting the business. It's not just, here are the nerds in the corner.
Is that part of your marketing of yourself as well and your networking?
Absolutely. There's a reason I use the Slytherin photo a lot. One, because even though I saw some comments to the contrary, Slytherin is still the best house. We're just misunderstood. But it also helps. It helps engage. It helps start conversations. It gets people talking to you as a person versus just as the technologist, as the executive that's telling them to do something. And it's important. Send out a newsletter, a threat intelligence briefing, or make awareness fun instead of just a video they watch once a year. Being able to convey why you exist and why people are spending money and why a developer needs to allocate time in their busy day to fix security issues is huge. You could find all the vulnerabilities in the world, but if you can't communicate why it's important and which ones are important, they're just going to pile up. And what I ended up doing when I first started, and I think this type of framework applies across the board, is not just if you're a CISO, but observe and learn. Understand, how does the team operate currently? Understand the business, how they make money. The biggest weakness I've seen in security teams is they really don't understand how the company makes money. And then they don't understand why certain security recommendations aren't looked at. If you understand a bit about how they make money, why they do things the way they do, you can then formulate your strategy. Then you can assess, how do they perform? Is it in line with best practices? Are there any gaps that you can address easily? Plan for how to address the difficult ones later. And then, as I said, market yourself, market your team, market your plans, market your culture, build out those security champions, those liaisons, send a few people from the development team to Black Hat, send a few people to conferences, sponsor trainings, make it fun. And then obviously execute on that plan, communicate, research threats, and go back to the observe and learn. Understand now, if you've done all of this, what worked well, what didn't work. Is something about the industry leading them to make certain decisions that you may not understand? And once you can figure that out, you can build your program and a more cohesive structure around it. And as we talked about before, communication in the workplace is huge. A lot of times, like, I've been at companies, when I started my career, I was at a major consulting company. And a lot of times they had made sweeping decisions that impacted how people did business, but it hadn't really communicated it beforehand. So you would have people that goes, well, I can't log in the way I used to. I can't access XYZ. If you're able to explain why you're doing certain things, or even solicit feedback beforehand, you become an enabler, not just a cost center.
Mm-hmm.
The best area for communication is when I worked at a company, we were actually flown with the sales representative to a major client. And the only reason they selected us was they felt that our security and our program was better than the competitor's program. So we were really able to demonstrate that we were an enabler, not just a typical cost center.
Wow.
And the way we do that is we talk about the business. We don't talk about SQL injection means this, cross-site scripting means this. You could talk about that to the developers, but when you talk to leadership, explaining how loss of data can cause an issue or defacement of a website can cause an issue, when you explain from a business perspective how things work, you'll find you'll get much more traction. And the last piece I'll say on the communication side is, don't use FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, without a very clear reason or objective. It's very tempting with board presentations to show a giant red graph about you have millions and millions of vulnerabilities and the sky is falling. But then they're going to ask and say, well, is that good? Is that bad? Are we better than
What are
our
you doing
peers?
about it?
What are you doing? So always stick with your facts, with observations, with anecdotes. Just always stay grounded. And to that, from the skills perspective, from a survey about what CISOs think are important, you'll actually notice that the technical expertise has decreased in importance according to the survey. That business knowledge, that strategic thinking is extremely, extremely important. Understanding why you're protecting, how you're protecting it, and what you need to do to improve is more important than technically knowing which button in a tool will get you the result.
Because you can hire someone for that.
Absolutely. You can always train for security, you can train for technical, but for having that knowledge of how security can bridge to the business, that's really crucial. Understanding it's not just that I have 5 million vulnerabilities, but if I fix these 3, I've addressed all possible exploits from an attacker on the outside coming in. That just changed the entire landscape and that changed the discussion.
Yeah, I think that how security bridges to the business is absolutely fundamental to a CISO's success. And that's why that BISO role is really a great way to start, or an assistant BISO, because you can understand the business needs, then you can learn about how the security is applied, and then you can figure out how the two come together.
Absolutely. And I think that's where the consulting side really helped shape my career. Is I treated consulting like security now, I treat myself still as a consultant. My stakeholders are more often than not just internal instead of external. You're an advisor. For instance, I have never, ever approved a risk exception. I have never said we will allow or not allow. My goal as the CISO is to convey what the risk is of taking a certain action. And then it's up to the business to decide, are we okay with that? And a lot of that came from that consulting mindset is we're here to help explain the risk, make sure you know all of the options. And then it's up to the business side to determine, are we okay with this or not? There's been times where I've had stuff where I said, this is a pretty high risk. And they said, this is going to bring us 30 million in revenue in 2 years. We're going to do it. Now let's figure out a mitigating control instead. And that's perfectly fine. So essentially what I did those first 90 days, taking that framework in, is I looked at what the team was capable of doing, looked at that program and how it related to the business, which included looking at the policy, standards, procedures that were there. It's not the most glamorous or fun at times to review documentation, but it's also a good way to see what have the teams communicated to employees. What are people aware of in terms of what their responsibility is for security? Understanding what the budget was. What are we spending on security and what were we spending it on? And I spent a lot of time just doing meet and greets. I would just go through the company directory and just put meetings on people's calendars, understand what do you do for work? I had a portfolio manager just walk me through for an hour. What is his day-to-day? How does he work? What tools does he use? What is his process? And then I ask people what they hate about security. Because especially when you first start at a place, everyone is willing to tell you what they hate because they know you're not going to take it personally. If you wait to ask the question, you're not going to get as many honest answers. And then based on that, you can build out your gap assessment. Where are the tools not working? I had one trader show me how they were able to bypass certain controls easily. And I was like, all right, we have a gap. We were able to determine other issues going on from a process, from a people perspective, from a technical perspective. And then we benchmarked it against industry frameworks. So that when you go for your budget and you talk to the leadership, you talk to the board, you're using a recognized framework to say, I don't just want a lot of budget because I want to roll around in the money. This is what we want to accomplish, and here's how it aligns to what our peers and competitors are doing. And then what's important is to set those expectations. Make sure that the business understands what your role is, and if you're going to be implementing any changes, if you're going to change how they operate, make sure they understand when that will happen, how that will happen, and have that dialogue early. And just, I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is just an example I thought worth mentioning. These are some of the major security functions you will see a CISO responsible for. However, in a lot of organizations, you're not going to have people that are solely responsible for these. I'm in a relatively small shop right now. We don't have a head for every single one of these functions. So when you map out your first 90 days, figure out which functions are really important. If you have a lot of websites, a lot of web presence, application security is going to be more important than if you don't have any external applications whatsoever. Mapping out your projects to the functions and then structuring your team to those functions is important. And an area that I think doesn't get enough attention is security awareness. This is one of the most overlooked areas because it's very challenging to develop a new and engaging idea. A lot of times people will just buy a video, make people spend 2 hours, and then they'll send a phishing campaign. But that doesn't engage with users. It doesn't teach them. I had a conversation with one of our executives who said he used to hate those trainings because he's like, I get it, I'm a smart person. Use a VPN, don't click the link, use multi-factor. And he's like, the videos are meant for the lowest common denominator, is the way he put it. And he's not wrong. It's important to have that reinforcement. But your awareness team, if you enable them properly, they can come up with creative ways to engage beyond that. When I had a basic discussion and I said, these are the types of events we see, here's something in the news and they broke in because of this, and this is how they did it. He found it fascinating. He's like, oh, I didn't learn that that's how they would try to target. So now I'm thinking of how I can fix X, Y, and Z. That was one of the most valuable discussions I've had to this day. And to help with that is, we talk about communication. Reporting is extremely important for that. It's not just metrics to your leadership, though that is important, and I'll share some example metrics, but it's making sure that you're transparent about the work that you've been doing. And when I shared, for example, what our phishing statistics were with our data team, they were able to say like, hey, if we massage it like this, or if we think of it in this way, we can now get a better sense of which departments will traditionally fall for certain types of campaigns. Not just, are they more likely to fall for phishing? It's, are they more likely to fall for phishing that targets an invoice, that targets X, Y, and Z? So being able to bring that up is very, very valuable. And then I see we did have a question. I think this was yours, Stacy.
Yep. So it was my question actually to the group to kind of tell us what roles they're currently in and what roles they're possibly looking to go into. So maybe we can kind of target the conversation to personal advice. And does anyone want to go ahead and share in the chat box?
Or feel free to unmute, chime in. Don't be shy.
While we're waiting for them to answer, what associations other than Women in Cybersecurity would you recommend that people join?
So I would say there's a lot of organizations out there depending on different areas. Like I member of WCES, there's a group called Cyversity that I'm a member of as well. But I think what's more important than the individual groups is finding out, based on your interests, where you want to align. If you're in New York, which I believe a lot of us are on this call, if in New York, they have groups such as Empire Hacking, where they'll get together every so often, meet up and talk about some technical areas. So I think just finding those meetups is important. Just being able to pick someone's brain. I love at a bar just saying, I'll buy you a shot of whiskey, but I want you to answer all of my questions until you're done.
But it's only a shot. That doesn't take very long.
Well, get more. All right. So I see that we have several people in the security and compliance, helping support VCISOs, which are virtual chief information security officers. So oftentimes a VCISO can be thought of as kind of the consulting CISO. And I actually know a few people that made that transition and have really, really loved it because it gives you that mix of being a technical CISO here, a strategic CISO here, a compliance CISO here. And GRC is something that we haven't touched on too much, the governance, risk, and compliance, but having that understanding is a very, very good foundation for security, understanding how security is impacting the program as a whole, how security is actually driving change or not driving it, understanding the risks that you're managing. That helps when you talk to the boards, when you're interviewing, being able to explain that you have a process to identify a risk and that you have a process in order to address issues. That's really, really valuable. And from the roles from a GRC side, definitely make the most of your partnerships. Where I've seen some programs struggle with GRC in particular is where they operate as a silo, where when there's a problem, people will come to them and they have to manage getting risks and documenting it and getting an acceptance. But make sure to reach out to the other teams, understand how did that risk get found, understand a little bit more foundationally. And that's really going to help as you go through your career. I did promise some example metrics, some of what I've used to present, and this is purely from the tactical side. This is just examples, but what's important to note is that you always want to quantify your metrics. It's very hard in security to provide metrics saying, there's a lot of bad guys, we have problems. But saying that 90% of our systems are 3 months behind in patching is very, very, very valuable. Understanding what percentage of your endpoints are missing the security agents. And jumping to the bottom one, showing a heat map of inherent versus residual risk. So as an example, let's take ransomware. Everyone's familiar with ransomware. Your management will be familiar. What is the inherent risk of ransomware? What is the likelihood ransomware will hit your company? And what would be the impact? And then you take that residual risk, which takes in all of those mitigating controls that you've built your program on, building out your proxies, your firewalls, your endpoint agents, your microsegmentation, zero trust buzzword. How does that shift risk? And if you could show the heat map, maybe ransomware is not going to be the most important thing to focus on because there's other areas that you haven't applied. And absolutely, Elizabeth, I agree. A lot of people forget the concept of residual risk. And I've had conversations at times with companies when I was consulting where the risk team themselves weren't really used to using residual risk to show here's where we really are. And sometimes to figure that out, one of my favorite slides is you have to know what you don't know. And you have to be okay that there's stuff that you actually don't know at all. And as an example, you're known knowns. You know what your vulnerabilities are, and you know what you need to do to fix them. What you don't know, though, is did you actually find every single one of your systems to assess? So being able to build this out and target and understand and present, here's the risks that we're finding, is really, really crucial. And then last, I'll leave you with kind of what I thought of as the next steps. You've gone through your 90 days. Everyone here is now that successful CISO, vCISO. You want to build that 1 year, 3 year, and 5 year roadmap. You want to be very realistic. I myself have a very big tendency to look at a problem and say, oh, this should be simple to solve. I know exactly the steps that are needed. But then don't take into account, well, I'm going to need one person on the network team and one person on the systems team to do it. They have their own projects that you might not be aware of, and they might not even have that background you do to know what needs to be done. So you always have to bake in that time and understand what realistically can we accomplish. And if you do more than that, great. But definitely err on the side of like undercommit versus overcommit. I communicated those results. We built out policies. We built a program to remediate any issues we found. We developed metrics for leadership similar to those example metrics. Most of those are numbers that I do report. So they are actually numbers that a lot of CISOs will report on. And then think of your stakeholders as your customers. You don't want to be opaque. You want to be transparent. I actually build release notes for security. And every quarter, I talk about what was new, what changed, what did we fix, and what are the bugs, what are some of the issues. And by doing it in that way, people get a little bit more of a sense of how to engage with security, what we're working on, how we can help out. And with that, I'll leave this with any questions and an adorable panda photo.
Anyone else want to put questions into the chat? So I see that we've got a bunch of networking already going on in the chat. That's fantastic.
Oh, what a day at work looks like. Oh, that's a good question. There's no real traditional day, but what I found that I do every day is I'm a big fan of trying to be organized. So we use Jira for my team, and it's not super rigid the way developers do, but I sit down with my team and we just go through what broke. Because what I find with security is things break a lot that you didn't anticipate. You can have a program in for months and months and months, and then someone found something that broke. So we spend the first part of the day just going through, are there anything like breaking that we have to deal with, drop everything? What are some of the risks to our strategy? And then we get a little bit tactical. What are we trying to accomplish for the day? What are we trying to accomplish for the week? And trying to deal with it in bite-sized chunks. A lot of my day, I do talk to vendors, I do talk to our executives and our leaders. A lot of what I do is marketing for the team, trying to push, I want to do microsegmentation. Does that mean it's going to be more difficult for the developers? Absolutely. So I'm on a campaign with my teams to go through, this is why it's a good thing. This is how we will help you through the pain. And yeah, it's a lot of marketing. And then sometimes, because I want to prove I'm still technical, I'll write a few scripts and commit it to our Git repository. And I'll say the biggest challenge in the CISO capacity is balancing priorities. It's very easy to look at reports and see that you have a number of critical issues, red issues. Oh my God, we have, like, let's take SolarWinds as an example. I'm sure everyone saw that attack over the last year. Major vendor that a lot of companies used had a security issue, and people were scrambling. Or Log4j, the common library that is used by a lot of applications, and people had to understand where they were vulnerable. The challenge is understanding what is the priority, what is the scope of the problem, and then I'll give you a hypothetical. If we found that vulnerable library, which everyone in the world was saying is a major issue, and it turns out we only had it on 2 systems that are internal only, that are segmented off, that's not a high priority. So balancing out what we need to fix when, and when we need to insist on breaking someone's process. If that system was publicly exposed to the internet, we might have had to say, you know what, I know you're working on a major release and it's tied to revenue, but this is an absolutely critical issue and we have to disrupt the business process. That obviously necessitates lots of calls, lots of discussions, and building out when we do that. So I think that is the biggest challenge, is how we balance that priority. So security is not the team that cried wolf, that we don't come all the time saying we have to do out of band work, and that we're there when it matters. Any other questions? All right. Well, if not, if you ever want to reach out to me individually, if you have questions you want to ask, definitely reach out to me on LinkedIn, on Twitter. You can send me an email. Always happy to talk security. Stacy knows I will go on and on about it. But I absolutely love.
You do enjoy it almost more than anyone else I know, Aaron. And I really appreciate
that as a compliment.
It is absolutely a compliment. And I very much appreciate you taking the time to talk to the group today, because I know that you're very, very busy. But this was great and I really appreciate it. And by all means, everyone, please feel free to link up with all of us. We're always interested in helping one another. I think that's one of the fundamental differences that I have found being in cyber than in other areas is there isn't competition. Everyone's working together to lift up. And that's also true company to company, I have found, which is very interesting. And again, it's very different than any other part of any industry. So please definitely feel free to stay in touch. And thank you all for coming today.
All right, thank you. Take care.
Bye, everyone.